The Newport mansion still stands along Bellevue Avenue, its marble walls gleaming and gardens perfectly kept. Yet locals won't speak its name. Behind that elegant facade is a history so grim that 3 generations of Rhode Island families have worked to keep it buried. Between 1861 and 1863, 7 men died inside the estate, all tied to the same woman, all showing the same gruesome symptoms: violent convulsions, blackened fingernails, and the bitter almond scent that gave away arsenic poisoning. What makes the case even more chilling is what came to light decades later. The killer had help, and not just from strangers. Some of the very family members being poisoned were complicit in the crimes. The story of Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring resurfaced in 1924, when renovation crews uncovered a hidden compartment behind the library walls. Inside were documents that shattered the carefully preserved image of one of Newport's most respected families. To understand how this horror unfolded, you need to picture Newport, Rhode Island in the spring of 1861. While the nation edged towards civil war, Newport's elite lived in a bubble of luxury. Fortunes built on shipping textiles and international trade turned the city into a seaside paradise for the wealthy. Along Bellevue Avenue, the mansions often called summer cottages rose like monuments to American ambition. Among them was Ravenscraft Manor, the Aldridge family's 40-room estate built in 1847, filled with imported marble, crystal, and mahogany, a house meant to rival Europe's grand palaces. From its windows, the Atlantic shimmered like a jewel, and the house seemed to gaze over the coastline with golden eyes in the morning sun. At the center of it all was Margaret Aldridge. At 47, she had already endured the loss of her husband Edmund, whose sudden death in a supposed riding accident left her in control of the Aldridge fortune. Far from overwhelmed, she proved herself more capable than anyone expected, running the estate and its wealth with sharp intelligence. Those who encountered her described a woman who commanded attention the moment she entered a room. Tall, slender, with piercing steel-gray eyes that weighed everything they saw. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was always immaculately styled, and her wardrobe of deep blues and blacks gave her a mysterious aura of mourning that many found strangely alluring. Margaret Aldridge wasn't just a widow of status, she was a figure of power, influence, and, as history would reveal, unimaginable darkness. Margaret's daughters represented the legacy she was determined to protect. Eleanor, at 23, embodied the ideal of Newport society, graceful, beautiful, accomplished, and with a gentle charm that made her one of the city's most admired young women. Her younger sister, Catherine, at 21, had inherited her mother's sharp intellect, but paired it with a bold and spirited nature that sometimes clashed with Margaret's preference for quiet, obedient daughters. The Aldridge fortune remained vast, but it was no longer untouchable. Edmund's ill-advised ventures had drained resources, and with the nation on the brink of war, the shipping trade that supported much of their wealth faced growing uncertainty. Margaret knew her daughters' marriages were more than personal choices. They were the key to preserving the family's influence and status. One poor match could unravel everything. Against this backdrop, Eleanor's engagement to Charles Whitfield of Boston seemed like a divine stroke of fortune. At 26, Charles had the perfect pedigree, tall, confident, educated at Harvard, and heir to a textile fortune that promised financial security and political connections. Newport society declared the union flawless, and Charles appeared deeply devoted, showering Eleanor with letters filled with poetry and passionate vows. Eleanor's affection was quieter, but she seemed content, and the June wedding promised to be one of the season's grandest events. Margaret, ever the strategist, poured herself into the preparations. She selected the finest fabrics for Eleanor's gown, oversaw the cathedral's floral arrangements, and insisted Charles spend extended visits at Ravenscraft Manor so she could know him better. To outsiders, her diligence looked like maternal care. But Margaret's interest in her future son-in-law was rooted in something far darker. From the moment she met him, she sensed in Charles not only a man of charm and promise, but also a challenge and opportunity to restore her control over the family's fortunes in a way no simple marriage could. For Margaret, love was irrelevant. What thrilled her was the hunt, the calculation of risk and reward, and the possibility of solving her looming financial worries once and for all. The first hints of danger came in April of 1861. Charles had been staying nearly a week discussing legal documents tied to the merging of their estates and indulging in the rhythm of manor life. One evening, as the household settled into its familiar routine, Eleanor at the piano, Catherine reading by lamplight, servants bustling in the kitchen, Margaret stepped onto the terrace. There, under the fading sky, she found Charles alone, a cigarette glowing between his fingers as he watched the Atlantic crash against the rocks below. The moon hung heavy and bright over the Atlantic, its glow turning the terrace into a stage where every shadow seemed deliberate. Margaret glided toward Charles with 2 glasses of brandy, her silk gown catching the light in a way that reminded him she was far from the grieving widow society painted her to be. "You seem troubled, Charles," she said, her voice smooth as velvet, as she handed him a glass. "Surely it isn't the thought of marrying my daughter that weighs on you?" He forced a smile, grateful for the drink, but uneasy at how close she stood, her perfume wrapping around him like a net. "Not troubled exactly," he replied after a sip. "Just thinking about the future, the war, the changes coming. Sometimes it feels like we're living in a dream that's about to end." Margaret stepped closer, close enough for him to feel the heat radiating from her body. "Dreams can be dangerous things," she murmured. "They blind us to what's right in front of us." For nearly an hour she kept him talking, steering the conversation with surgical precision. She teased out his worries about money, about his career, about whether he deserved Eleanor's love, and each time positioned herself as the one person who truly understood. What Charles couldn't know was that Margaret had been preparing for this moment. She had studied his letters to Eleanor, probed his family's finances, and discovered his inheritance was even greater than she imagined. She had even begun lacing his evening brandy with a mild sedative, nothing deadly, just enough to soften his defenses. On the terrace that night, she tested her power, a lingering laugh, a hand brushing his arm. A compliment delivered with eyes that lingered too long. Charles, lightheaded from the brandy and disoriented by her attention, faltered. "You're not at all what I expected," he admitted, his words dragging. "When Eleanor spoke of you, I imagined someone more conventional." Margaret leaned in, her steel-gray eyes locking onto his. "And what do you think of me now?" His throat tightened. "I think Eleanor is fortunate," he stammered, "to have inherited her grace and intelligence from such a remarkable woman." It was the opening Margaret wanted. She moved closer, her breath warm against his skin as she whispered, "Some lessons in life require a more personal form of education." But she didn't push further. She was too skilled to close the trap so quickly. Instead, she stepped back, leaving Charles shaken, guilty, and confused, unsure whether he had misread everything or had nearly crossed a line he could never undo. Inside, Eleanor played piano, unaware of the storm gathering on the terrace, while Catherine glanced up from her book only long enough to notice Charles's pale, restless expression when he returned. She assumed it was nothing more than wedding nerves. The servants, trained to remain invisible in a house of wealth and secrets, noticed nothing unusual that evening. To them, it was simply another night in a household consumed with wedding preparations. But Sarah Connolly, Margaret's longtime maid, saw more than most. Sharp-eyed and loyal for 15 years, Sarah had learned to read her mistress's moods with precision. As she brushed out Margaret's hair before bed, she caught sight of the expression in the mirror, not the soft glow of a proud mother, but the satisfied, predatory smile of someone savoring control. "You seem pleased with the evening, ma'am," Sarah ventured cautiously. Margaret's lips curved into that unsettling smile again. "Yes, Sarah. Everything is proceeding exactly as it should." The following morning, Ravenscraft Manor received an unexpected visitor. Dr. William Hensley, the family physician, and a trusted presence since the births of Margaret's daughters, arrived with a heavy look. Ushered into the privacy of Margaret's study, he accepted the tea she poured with visible reluctance. "There are rumors, Margaret," he said gravely. "Questions about Edmund's death, questions I had hoped would never surface." Margaret's hand trembled only slightly as she set the teapot down, her face otherwise composed. "Questions about a riding accident." Dr. Hensley sighed, his gray eyes weary from decades of watching life slip through his patient's fingers. "It's the symptoms, Margaret. The convulsions, the stomach distress, even the darkening of his fingernails in those last days. At the time, I believed them the result of internal injuries. But some of my colleagues suggest the progression was far more consistent with poisoning." Margaret's tone was measured, almost cool. "Surely you're not implying my husband was murdered?" "By whom? For what purpose?" The physician quickly shook his head. "I'm not accusing anyone. I only mean to warn you, rumors travel fast, and if they reach the wrong people, the consequences could be serious." What he didn't admit was that the spark of suspicion had been lit by Charles Whitfield himself. At a dinner party the week before, Charles had mentioned Edmund's death in passing to Dr. James Morrison, a Boston physician known for investigating poisonings. Morrison's probing questions had stirred doubt, and soon whispers spread through Newport's medical circles. Charles's curiosity hadn't been born of distrust, but of training. He had been combing through the Aldridge financial records while preparing the marriage contracts and had noticed troubling irregularities. Edmund had altered his will and insurance policies in the months before his death, funneling greater control and assets directly to Margaret. The timing, when paired with the symptoms, was damning. After Dr. Hensley departed, Margaret remained in her study, staring out at the restless Atlantic. She had always known this moment might come, had prepared for it in theory. Now the first cracks were forming in the facade she had so carefully maintained. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of risk pressing in and began calculating how far she would go to silence suspicion before it consumed her. Margaret had always prepared for whispers about Edmund's death, but she had never imagined the threat would come from Charles himself. That realization hardened her resolve. What began as a desperate act of survival years earlier was about to evolve into something far more calculated and monstrous. She would not only outlast the suspicions swirling around her, she would turn them into a weapon. Charles's probing questions revealed him to be dangerous, yes, but also useful. He had the intelligence, the legal training, and the position within her family's circle to be molded into an accomplice. And Margaret intended to do just that. Her plan was audacious. She would seduce Charles not simply to break his bond with Elela Nana, but to bind him to her in a conspiracy that secured the Aldridge fortune once and for all. With his legal knowledge, he could help design a web of accidents that would neatly remove anyone who stood in her way. Society rivals suspicious doctors, even her own daughters, if the balance of power demanded it. All she needed was his absolute submission. That night, long after the manor had fallen quiet, Margaret moved silently through the halls to Charles's chamber. His brandy had been laced more heavily than before, leaving him dazed, vulnerable, and unsteady. What followed in that room blurred the line between seduction and entrapment, leaving Charles compromised in a way that could never be undone. Decades later, when workers uncovered the hidden cache of documents in 1924, among them was a letter in Charles's own hand, sealed with instructions to be opened only upon his death. The contents of that confession so horrified officials that some argued it should be destroyed rather than preserved. By the next morning, Charles was no longer the eager young fiancé of Newport's darling. He had become Margaret's pawn, both lover and accomplice. Eleanor remained blissfully unaware, practicing her piano with the serenity of a bride-to-be, while Catherine's keen eyes began to notice the subtle shifts. Charles's smile grew strained. His thoughts wandered, and his glances toward Margaret carried an intensity Eleanor could not explain. Catherine observed private exchanges between them, conversations that fell silent the moment she entered chairs drawn too close together for comfort. When she raised her suspicions, Eleanor dismissed them as nothing more than Charles's attempts to grow closer to his future mother-in-law. But the truth was far darker. In their whispered conversations, Margaret laid bare her secrets to Charles. She told him Edmund's death had not been an accident, but an act of necessity. She spoke of forged papers and carefully staged circumstances, spinning the story as a tragic tale of survival against a cruel, unfaithful husband who had plotted to strip her of everything. In Margaret's telling, she had saved her daughters from ruin. To Charles, still reeling from desire and guilt, it sounded less like confession and more like justification, a justification that would slowly drag him deeper into a conspiracy he could neither escape nor resist. "I never wanted to become this person," she told Charles in one of their secret meetings, letting a slow, practiced tear fall, as if confessing some private torment, and then she translated that torment into a choice between her daughter's future and her own soul. What mother would not sacrifice everything to protect her children? Charles, already tangled in guilt over his betrayal and still raw from their night together, found himself strangely receptive to her story. Margaret mixed truth and invention so smoothly that his doubts dissolved into a desperate, rationalizing empathy. She painted herself as a woman backed into impossible corners, forced to take terrible measures by a husband who would have ruined them, and a world that would strip the girls of their place without decisive action. His first task seemed innocent enough, a review of the Aldridge legal papers to spot vulnerabilities and shore up the estate, so he threw himself into it with the earnestness of a man trying to redeem himself. What he unearthed should have frozen him. A pattern of last-minute will changes, insurance shifts, and deed alterations that funneled advantage to Margaret at precise moments, and echoes of the same pattern around other sudden deaths linked to the family. There was the boating accident that killed Margaret's first husband, and, more chilling to Charles, the carriage crash that ended Thomas Richardson, Eleanor's previous fiancé, and someone Charles had known at Harvard. Thomas had been a fine horseman, steady and confident. The story of a panicked team on a calm road simply did not add up. When Charles confronted Margaret expecting outrage or denial, she gave him something colder and far more persuasive confirmation, paired with a justification so clinical it left him reeling. Thomas, she said, had discovered things about Edmund that made him a danger, and she had acted to protect her daughters. The other death months were unfortunate coincidences that could be misread by suspicious minds, but not sinister in intent. Then she laid her hand on his arm close and claiming intimacy, and told him why she needed him. Someone with his legal mind to smooth the edges, to make the next accidents unassailable, to secure the family's future, without anyone else getting hurt. Horror and a perverse admiration warred inside him. He could not deny a begrudging respect for her strategic coolness. She was not a creature of madness or cruelty for its own sake. He thought she was a strategist, removing threats with the precise logic of a commander. As he left the library that night, papers clutched in his hand, Charles realized that he was no longer an outsider, looking in but a participant, and that realization settled over him like a weight that would only grow heavier with every secret he helped conceal. In his weakened state, Charles began twisting Margaret's crimes into grim necessities, convincing himself that he was helping preserve the family rather than aiding its destruction. The final snare came when Margaret revealed what she framed as her greatest burden, Elela Nina herself. With a mother's practiced anguish, she told Charles that Eleanor had grown suspicious, asking questions about Thomas Richardson's death and corresponding with Boston relatives who might piece together the family's string of suspicious accidents. Margaret spoke with trembling sincerity, how much she loved her daughter, how naive the girl was about the danger such truths could unleash, and how exposure would destroy not just Eleanor, but Catherine Charles and every hope of a secure future. Then came the solution spoken with quiet finality. Eleanor would have to suffer an untimely accident. Heartbreaking, yes, but the only way to protect them all. The suggestion should have jolted Charles awake, sent him running from the manor to confess everything. Instead, he found himself asking questions about logistics and timing, as if he were drafting a contract, not plotting the death of his own fiancé. The transformation was complete. The idealistic young man who had come to Newport to marry for love was now Margaret Aldridge's accomplice, ensnared in a scheme to murder the woman he once swore to cherish. Eleanor's suspicions took shape one stormy morning in May. She descended into the cellar and caught sight of her mother and Charles standing close together, whispering intently over a bottle of wine thick with dust. When they noticed her, both froze, guilt flashing across their faces. "We were just selecting wine for tonight's dinner," Margaret explained smoothly, though Eleanor saw that neither held the bottle any longer. "Charles has developed quite an appreciation for our cellar." Eleanor smiled politely, but unease pricked at her. She was certain she had glimpsed Charles slip something small into his jacket pocket as she entered. That evening she watched them more carefully. Margaret's hand lingered as she passed Charles the salt. Their glances carried unspoken meanings, their conversations laced with an intimacy Eleanor could not explain. Then, as she casually mentioned receiving a letter from Thomas Richardson's sister in Boston, asking questions about the accident that had killed her brother, the reaction was instant. Margaret's fork froze midair, and Charles, pale and rattled, dropped his glass. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like fresh blood. "How clumsy of me," he muttered, his voice taut as he fumbled for a napkin. Eleanor forced herself to smile, clutching Thomas's portfolio beneath her skirts as if it were a lifeline. "You're right, Mother," she said softly, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "I suppose it was foolish of me." Margaret studied her for a long moment, her lamp casting shadows that seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. Then, with a measured nod, she set the lamp on a nearby table and began carefully folding Thomas's clothes back into the trunk, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. Eleanor watched every instinct, screaming that she was in the presence of a predator who had just scented fear. When Margaret finally left her in the attic, Eleanor did not move for several minutes. Only after she was certain her mother's footsteps had faded did she slip from the room, clutching the hidden portfolio as if it might vanish from her hands. Alone in her chambers, she read the letter to the Newport police chief again and again, her terror deepening with every line. Thomas had been so close, days away from exposing the truth before his sudden accident. Now she understood why Margaret had insisted on drawing Charles so deeply into the family. He wasn't her protector, he was her mother's tool. That night, Eleanor barely slept, haunted by the realization that she was living in a house where every smile might conceal betrayal, where every glass of wine, every cup of tea could be her last. But even through her fear, she felt a grim determination. If Thomas had died trying to reveal the truth, she would honor him by finishing what he had started. Margaret, meanwhile, returned to her room calm and composed. She had seen the flicker of defiance in Eleanor's eyes, the way her daughter's voice had trembled yet held firm. She knew then that Eleanor would not let the matter go, which meant Eleanor would need to be dealt with, and soon. Elena realized with growing horror that the woman in front of her was no mother she recognized, but a stranger who had taken her place, and she forced a smile and agreed to focus on the future while her mind raced. As Margaret turned to leave, a small glass vial slipped from her pocket and rolled to Elena's feet, a vial labeled in her mother S. Neat hand, for headaches used sparingly, and the bitter scent. Elena had noticed earlier suddenly made sense. This was not medicine, but poison. She knew then with cold clarity that the same smell had haunted the house during her father's final illness and before Thomas Richardson's death, and that the pile of secrets in Thomas's trunk meant he had been killed for seeking the truth. Hiding the leather portfolio under her skirts, Elena felt the attic close around her. She was living under the roof of a woman who had murdered at least twice and planned to do it again. Logic suggested Charles, as Margaret's co-conspirator, might be safe. But she did not know that Margaret had already decided Charles knew too much and that even he was expendable. Arsenic was everywhere in 1861, and simple to disguise in food and drink, and with medical knowledge limited, it made a perfect slow weapon for someone sparing enough to avoid detection. Over the next days, Elena moved like a ghost through her own home, skipping meals, carrying Thomas's portfolio hidden against her body, pretending wedding nerves, while trying to buy time, and on May 15th, she hid on the cellar stairs and listened as her worst suspicions were confirmed. Margaret spoke with cold business about increasing the dosage because Elena was resisting and must be incapacitated before the wedding. And Charles responded with visible anguish even as the talk turned to logistics. In that moment, Elena understood the full, monstrous shape of the conspiracy. Her mother had not only betrayed every vow of motherhood, but had made a calculated plan to protect her fortune by any means, and the people she loved were either tools in that plan or targets of it, leaving Elena locked in a race to expose the truth before the next accident took her life. Eleonora froze her breath, catching as the moonlight revealed the revolver steady in her mother's hand. The calmness in Margaret's voice was more terrifying than if she had screamed icy, deliberate, certain. "You've disappointed me, my dear," Margaret continued, her eyes glinting like steel. "I wanted this to be clean, simple, dignified. But you insist on forcing my hand." Eleonora's mind raced. The bag at her side felt suddenly heavy, the leather portfolio within pressing against her hip, like a reminder that she held not just her survival, but the only proof of her mother's crimes. Running was impossible. The open lawn stretched like a killing field. Her only chance was to stall. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling despite her best effort to steady it. "Catherine needs me. Charles needs me. If you hurt me, you'll destroy everything you've built." Margaret's laugh was soft and merciless. "On the contrary, my dear, removing you is the only way to preserve it. Catherine will be tended to, and Charles, well, he's already so entangled in my web, he'll never escape. You're the only loose thread." Margaret stepped closer, the revolver gleaming as she raised it. Eleonora's knees nearly gave way, but at that moment the stable door creaked open. A lantern flared, and Sarah Connolly, Margaret's maid, stepped out with a startled cry. For a fraction of a second, Margaret's gaze flicked toward the interruption. It was all the chance Eleonora needed. She hurled her travel bag straight at her mother, the weight of the portfolio inside sending it crashing against Margaret's wrist. The revolver discharged the shot, splitting the night air, but the bullet went wide, shattering a stable window instead of finding its mark. Horses screamed and stamped in panic as Sarah dropped the lantern, its flame sputtering dangerously close to the hay. Eleonora didn't wait. She sprinted into the stable, grabbing the reins of the nearest horse as Margaret's furious voice rang out behind her. "You can't run from me forever." The revolver cracked again, sparks flying off the stable wall. But by the time Margaret fought through the chaos of rearing horses and scattering servants, her daughter was already thundering across the grounds, clinging desperately to the saddle and clutching the last hope of exposing the Aldridge legacy for what it truly was. Elelenina's voice was steady, even as terror threatened to overwhelm her. And Margaret's cold smile had barely faded when the night exploded with a gunshot that missed its mark. The sound tore through the quiet countryside, pulling servants from their beds and scattering birds into the sky, but the bullet's path had been spoiled by Catherine's desperate strike with the iron poker. In an instant, Margaret was on the ground, blood streaking her temple, her revolver spinning uselessly across the gravel. Catherine's shout. Run was almost lost in the chaos, but Elelenina was already moving. The sisters' flight through the darkened estate was frantic. Their skirts tangled as they scrambled into the stable hands, trembling as they threw saddles onto restless horses. Behind them came Margaret's shriek, raw and guttural, less human than beast. Ungrateful little bitches, I gave you everything. Her rage carried across the grounds, joined by the answering flare of Charles's lantern as he emerged from the manor, another weapon glinting in his hand. The sisters tore into the night, galloping down the drive, hooves striking sparks on stone, the looming mansion shrinking behind them. Every turn of the wheel of fate now hinged on speed. If they reached Newport before being overtaken, they had a chance. If not, they would vanish into the same silence that had claimed their father and Thomas Richardson. As the countryside rushed past, Elelenina shoved the leather portfolio into Catherine's hands. If anything happens to me, promise me you'll get this to the authorities. It's everything, every crime. Catherine clutched it tightly. Her jaw set, even as fear flashed in her eyes. Nothing will happen to you. We're both going to live, and Margaret will hang for this. But behind them, lanterns flickered and riders pressed hard, Margaret and Charles urging fresher horses that steadily closed the distance. The chase did not end until the sisters burst into Newport's town square screaming for help, their horses lathered with sweat and their voices hoarse from desperation. Windows flew open. Townsfolk poured into the streets, and the night constable rushed from his post just as Margaret and Charles thundered into the square behind them. The scene was chaos, two terrified daughters shrieking accusations, their mother arriving bloodied and wild-eyed, and a once-respected Boston heir at her side. What might have been dismissed as the hysterics of frightened young women turned to grim credibility when Catherine thrust the portfolio into the constable's hands. Thomas Richardson's meticulous notes, his unsent letter to the police chief, and the sisters' detailed knowledge of Margaret's poisons and forgeries painted a picture too precise to ignore. Dr. Hensley roused from his bed and summoned to town confirmed what the papers suggested. Edmund Aldridge's death had borne every sign of arsenic, the very suspicion that had haunted him for years. By dawn, Margaret Aldridge sat in the Ravenscroft drawing room, pale but composed, sipping her morning tea, as if nothing had happened. When the constable and his men entered to place her under arrest, she did not resist. Instead, she set her teacup down with deliberate care and said only, "History will remember me differently than you do." Charles, broken by fear and shame, offered no resistance either. But the sisters knew that their testimony and the evidence they had carried through the night would ensure Margaret Aldridge was remembered not as Newport's formidable matriarch, but as its most infamous murderess. When the weight of evidence came crashing down, Margaret Aldridge clung to her mask of dignity with unnerving skill. In the courtroom, she sat ramrod straight, answering accusations with icy calm, so convincing at times that whispers spread among Newport's elite. Perhaps the daughters had exaggerated, perhaps the prosecutors had overreached. That fragile doubt dissolved only when arsenic was discovered hidden throughout Ravenscroft Manor, tucked in the kitchen pantry, concealed in her bedroom, even stitched into the lining of her favorite coat. At last, her carefully maintained facade began to crumble. Charles Whitfield's downfall proved murkier. His jailhouse confession, written in a trembling hand, offered the most damning evidence of all, not just against Margaret, but against himself. The letter, later unearthed from sealed courthouse archives, detailed how Margaret had seduced and ensnared him, how she had woven justifications so persuasive he came to believe silence was the only way to protect Eleanor and Catherine. By the time I realized Margaret intended to kill Eleanor, regardless, he wrote, I was already trapped. Cowardice and desire made me her accomplice, and I fear history will remember me not as a victim, but as what I truly became, a willing participant. The trial itself became one of Rhode Island's most sensational spectacles. Crowds jammed into the courthouse, their whispers turning Newport society on its head. To the public's horror, the respectable widow of Ravenscroft Manor was revealed as a methodical poisoner who had murdered her way into power. Newspapers seized on every detail, the daughter's tearful testimony, Charles's confession, the dramatic forensic revelations. Margaret never wavered in her denials. She insisted Edmund's death was a tragic accident, Thomas Richardson's crash a cruel twist of fate, and her daughter's accusations nothing more than greedy fabrications meant to seize the family fortune. But the evidence was relentless. Arsenic laced the hair samples taken from Edmund's exhumed body. Thomas Richardson's remains, re-examined by experts, bore unmistakable signs of poisoning. Most damning of all, Eleanor's own body still carried significant traces of arsenic, living proof that Margaret had been poisoning her daughter in the weeks before the wedding. Charles received 20 years for his role in the conspiracy, though illness spared him from serving the full term. He died of consumption after 12 years, leaving behind a final letter to Eleanor, in which he begged forgiveness and admitted his weakness had nearly destroyed her life. Margaret Aldridge met a harsher fate. Sentenced to death by hanging, she became one of the few women in Rhode Island's history to face the gallows. On October 13, 1862, she walked with eerie composure, dressed in her finest black silk, her face showing nothing but faint irritation at the crowd's jeers. To the last breath, she proclaimed her innocence. In the aftermath, Eleanor and Catherine inherited what remained of the once vast Aldridge fortune. But rather than rebuild their lives in Newport, they sold Ravenscroft Manor and left the gilded society that had nearly consumed them. The sisters settled in California, where Eleanor, scarred but unbroken, dedicated her life to helping women escape violent and dangerous homes, determined that no one else would fall prey to the kind of predator she had called mother. Catherine went on to marry a physician and raise 4 children, but she never spoke a word in public about what had happened at Ravenscroft Manor. For her silence was both a shield and a prison. The mansion itself lingered in ruin for nearly 2 decades, avoided by locals and whispered about in taverns and parlors as a cursed place. Eventually, a wealthy Boston shipping family purchased the property, razed the manor, and built something entirely new, insisting they wanted no trace of the Aldridge legacy in their home. To them, it was just good sense. No one wanted to live in a house forever, stained by whispers of arsenic and betrayal. The story of Margaret Aldridge unsettled not just Newport, but the wider world, raising questions that linger even now. How many similar crimes slipped through the cracks in an era when doctors often mistook poison for illness, and society refused to believe women capable of cold, calculated murder? How many mothers, wives and daughters hid behind smiles and silk gowns, while quietly wielding death at their dinner tables? So what do you think? Was Margaret a desperate woman clawing for survival in a ruthless world, or a remorseless killer who exploited society's blind spots to mask her cruelty? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear how you see her. And if this tale of family betrayal and hidden murder gripped you, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. so you won't miss our next deep dive into history's darkest secrets. The truth about Margaret Aldridge and the Newport poisoning ring lay buried for over 60 years, locked in dusty files and sealed testimonies. It wasn't until the renovations of 1924 pried open hidden compartments that the full scope of her crimes came into view. Yet even today, the case leaves us with chilling uncertainties. How many victims did she truly claim? Were there others whose deaths were quietly folded into the ledger of accidents and illnesses? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many other women like Margaret Aldridge lived behind the lace curtains of Victorian America, cloaked in respectability while harboring the heart of a predator? Some mysteries never yield their answers, but the legacy of Margaret Aldridge stands as a warning. Evil does not always announce itself with violence or spectacle. Sometimes it smiles, serves tea, and whispers reassurance, while slowly, silently, it poisons everything it touches.